So we are all back. Okay. So we all had some conversations in our breakout rooms around what is Baldwin doing with the song that keeps playing in Jesse's head. What is the significance of Jesse's childhood friend Otis? And then what stood out to you most about Baldwin's writing style? Who wants to start us off in conversation? So, Brianna, what was discussed in your group's breakout room?
Oh, well, for the oldest question,
Whichever one you want.
yeah, well, I was gonna do that. Yeah, it was kind of like the white, like KKK kind of related to that, how the white people were like inflicting fear among the black people. And then like the Jesse's dad was like kind of like trying to, he's like a real racist, and he's like trying to make sure Otis doesn't grow up to be one of the African Americans who like try to like fight like against them, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And then so yeah, he's making them scared, like everybody in the white community trying to make them scared to like not like get outside because like they're like fearful of their lives. So
Okay.
yeah, they didn't haven't seen them in days. And then he was like really confused because he didn't really understand what was going on until he saw, what comes next with the lynching.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Brianna. Did anybody's group talk about the song at all? Yeah. Looking at the chat, Tanaya is kind of commenting on Baldwin's writing style. Why don't you expand upon that a little bit more, Tanaya? What stood out to you most about the writing style?
For his writing style, he's just very like there's not many books that I can read that will catch my interest and I can see what the scene is as I'm reading. And I just feel like while reading his this section of his book, it was kind of like I'm watching it as it plays out rather than I'm just reading a book about something that's going on. It's almost like I can see it in my mind what he's talking about.
Yeah, and honestly, Tanaya, like all of James Baldwin's writing is like that. It's very descriptive, and he does a great job of writing senses. How something smells, how something tastes, how something looks, how something feels, how something sounds. He incorporates that into his writing that really allows you as a reader to be displaced from where you are and to be replaced where Baldwin wants you to be. So I think that's a very good call out. Um, is there any questions that you guys have about the story before I go into my notes? Okay. Um, Go ahead, Brianna. Yeah, yeah, please. I forgot. Thank you for reminding me. Go ahead and say it out loud, please.
Well, yeah, when they were testing the song, like I kind of just thought that, well, yeah, it's annoying to them. Like they didn't really like it. But then Jesse was talking about how like he was thinking that they're like kind of like being merciful towards the white people at first. Like that was his mindset, because he was like thinking he was doing the right thing, like God's work, trying to like help the black people, protect them from themselves, and also protect the white people. So he thought, it was his duty, like it was his right. But then when he realized, like he started, going through these crazy things, and he's like, wow, it's really like trying to like mess with my mind, cast me down to hell,
Yeah,
like because of the sins. Like he didn't think anything about it.
yeah. That's a really good, astute read of how Baldwin uses that song to kind of insinuate guilt, right? Yeah, that's a very good call out. Okay. So I do ask that you guys get a pencil and paper. I'm going to give you the last theoretical framework of the semester. So we'll have three. This will be our third one. We know the first theoretical framework is African American male theory, which states that African people are resistant and resilient with innate capacity for brilliance. The second theoretical framework is Funds of Knowledge from Tarayoso, which states that knowledge is passed down by cultures that are often unrecognized. This knowledge allows these cultures to speak to their cultural uniqueness, and also allows these cultures to make sense of their place in the world. So that's the second theoretical framework. The final theoretical framework is counter storytelling. Is from the theory critical race theory. The tenet or the framework is counter storytelling. What counter storytelling may look and feel like. It's the telling of a story from the perspective of the marginalized group, not from the dominant or the power-based group, right? So if we're going to tell the story of American discovery, we're not going to tell that story from the vantage points of Christopher Columbus. You're going to tell that story from the vantage points of the indigenous people that were here on this land when Columbus arrived, right? So that's the counter storytelling. If we're going to tell the story of the George Floyd protests 2 summers ago, you're not going to tell that story from the vantage points of the police, of the store owners, of the mayors of the cities. You're going to tell that story from the protesters who are protesting because they're trying to express a grievance, right? So again, counter storytelling is about focusing your story on those who are marginalized opposed to the power group. Does everyone understand what and how counter storytelling works and what it is? Does anyone need me to further articulate or further clarify that? It's very important that you guys get this. Okay. The first one is African American male theory. And the African American male theory states that African people are resistant and resilient with an innate capacity for brilliance. That's the first theoretical framework, African American male theory. All right. So, what we're reading, or what you guys read, is a story from a book of collection of short stories called Going to Meet the Man. The story that you read was also Going to Meet the Man. The author is James Arthur Baldwin. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant author. Again, one of my favorite authors of all time. And I think tonight really hit it on the head as far as the descriptive nature of his writing style. This book was published in 1965. Okay. And when you're dealing with James Baldwin, because we're going to spend 2 weeks with Baldwin, it's important to understand what I call, and what he calls the pillars of white inferiority, right? And we know that I use white inferiority opposed to white supremacy, but he says that there's a pillars of white inferiority. Somebody tell me, what does a pillar do? What is a pillar intended to do? What does a pillar do in architecture? What's the significance or the importance? Miliano, can you say that out loud, please?
Support.
Support, absolutely. It holds the structure up, okay? So if we're talking about the 2 pillars for white inferiority, another way to understand this are the 2 phenomena that hold white inferiority up, that maintain this system, okay? One of them being the white imagination, the second one being the maintenance of white innocence, okay? So the white imagination and the maintaining white innocence are the 2 pillars that hold up this system of white inferiority. Now, in my understanding, right, I think the quintessential depiction of the white imagination could be found in the movies of Hollywood, right? Hollywood is a placeholder for the white imagination, right? It's where the white imagination can be materialized and produced into film. Is anybody familiar with the film A Birth of a Nation? The old one, not the remake that, what's the brother's name? Nate Parker did, but the original Birth of a Nation. Is anybody familiar with that film?
Yeah, I am. It was basically an attack on the Black community.
Can you kind of speak about that a little bit?
So The Birth of a Nation was a propaganda film meant to tear down the image of the Black community, depicting Black people as nothing more than fit to be in service to white men, and to be shown as Muslim less than.
Yeah. So, and some of the themes of the film, right? So, this is one, like, just to understand the context of the film and the American folklore. If you take any film class, that's going to be probably one of the first films that you will watch. This film is recognized as one of the greatest films in American cinema from the way that it's shot, the camera lens that's used. He does a lot of things technically that place this film far ahead of its time, right? But the theme of the film speaks directly to what we just heard from Mac. But let me kind of paint you the picture. So the setting of the film is the Reconstruction era. So it's post-Civil War. Black folks are now able to occupy positions in office. They're occupying positions in office, right? And how they're depicted within the office is, their feet on the Senate desk, right? Which I find is ironic if you think about what happened on January 6th. They're shown eating watermelon, eating chicken, right? And the town is upset with this shift in power that takes place, right? Another fear that comes to the fold in the film is the fear of black men raping white women. In fact, one of the apex of the movie is a black man is pursuing this white woman and she throws herself off a cliff to avoid being raped. Also, a little tidbit about the film: there are no black characters in the film. It's everyone who's depicted as black is a white person in blackface. Okay, that's another little tidbit of the film. So we have black people in political office. We have black people running rampant, raping white women. So this needs to be rectified. Boom, the Ku Klux Klan comes on the scene and they're able to save the nation, right? They are able to insinuate the birth of this new nation where African people are placed back in their place, okay? Again, the white imagination at play, right? These are the two things that white folks fear the most: the rape of their women by black men and black folks being in political power, right? Now, it's imaginatory because, by and large, if we are to do the statistical numbers of how many black men rape white women juxtaposed to how many white men raped black women, right, is disproportionate. So that fear is not a justifiable fear. This notion of black people being in political office and taking over power, let's just call it what it is, right? We had a black president. For the black folks in class, how much political power did you receive with Obama's presidency, right? How much did your material circumstance change with Obama in president? We have a half black vice president now, right? How much of our political material circumstance has changed? So again, these fears that they have are not based in reality, okay? The white imagination. Second pillar, the maintenance of white innocence. George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, Bosom John, Breonna Taylor. The list goes on, right? Those are all people who have been killed by the white power structure, okay? Homicides, we would call them. But what happens is they go to court and the police walk away with a slap on the wrist and they call it justifiable homicide, right? Why is it justifiable? What makes these homicides justifiable? Does anyone know? They all use the same excuse. In every circumstance, they use the same exact excuse that makes it justifiable. What's the excuse?
They were fearing for their life.
Fearing for my life. Exactly, Tanaya. So let's think about this, okay? You're trained. You go to the shooting range. You're trained in combat. You have a bulletproof vest. You have handcuffs, you have a taser, you have a gun, you have all kind of shit, a baton, right? But you're afraid of these black men, women, and children who, by and large, most of the time are unarmed, right? That are not in positions to be a threat to you, sometimes handcuffed, right? Very little could be done to you when you have someone in a chokehold, right? But you're afraid for your life. And because of the white imagination's fear of the black body, these homicides become justifiable, maintaining the innocence of the murderers who perpetrate these crimes, right? So you see how Baldwin is attentive to how these two forces work hand in hand to support this system of white inferiority, to support this system of power that white folks maintain within this country and globally throughout the world, right? So this notion of the Baldwinian pillars of white inferiority become important when you engage in Baldwin's work, right? The maintenance of white innocence, the white imagination. Does that make sense to you all? Do anyone need me to further explain that? Okay, so let's see how this kind of plays out in the text. So we know we have the protagonist, Jesse, right? And we know that we're dropped into his bedroom by Baldwin and he can't sleep, right? And so because he can't sleep, he's a man, he's trying to get it cracking, right? But he can't get it cracking. There's something that's preventing him from performing his acts. It's something that's preventing him from standing on to attention, if you will, right? And so what he does, he starts to think back. He starts to reflect and kind of go over his day, the things that made his day so rough, etc., right? And as he thinks about his day, he thinks about the protests that the black folks are having to ensure their ability to vote. And he's thinking about his job of quelling those protests and the things that he has to do, right? And he goes back to a scene that happened earlier in the day where he's in a cell and he's tasked to force the leader of this group to tell all the other black folks to stop singing, right? And the way that Baldwin writes this scene is very interesting to me. His foot leapt out. He had not known it was going to do so. And it caught the boy flush on the jaw, right? So the way that he writes is as if him kicking old boy in the face is an accident. He didn't mean to do that. He didn't know his foot was going to do that, right? Maintaining his innocence. And then he goes on to say that that singing, right? His singing is driving him mad. And he's trying to understand the singing, as Brianna is saying. And Baldwin writes, they were singing to God. They were singing for mercy and they hoped to go to heaven. And he had even sometimes felt, Jesse felt this, when looking into the eyes of some of the old women and a few of the old men, that they were singing for mercy for his soul too, right? So he's contemplating what the singing is doing. Then he goes further. He had never thought much about what it meant to be a good person. He tried to be a good person and to treat everybody right. It wasn't his fault if the niggers had to take it into their heads to fight against God and to go against the rules laid down in the Bible for everyone to read, right? So again, he's rationalizing his inhumane behavior to maintain his innocence. It's not his fault that they want to go against the word of God and they want to fight for their human rights. It's not his fault that they want to do that and now I have to do these brutal things, right? And Otis doesn't make an appearance in the story, but his presence is pervasive throughout the story, right? Or his lack of thereof becomes pervasive. And I found this very interesting. On page 243 towards the bottom, Baldwin writes, he had grown accustomed for the solutions of such mysteries to go to Otis. He felt that Otis knew everything, but he could not ask Otis about this. Anyway, he had not seen Otis for 2 days. He had not seen a blackface anywhere for more than 2 days. So right here, Baldwin is saying when Jesse has questions about race, he goes to Otis, right? Because Otis knew everything. Let me ask y'all, why do you think Otis knew everything about race? And what does it say about the parenting requirements for black communities juxtaposed to white communities as it pertains to race? Why do you think he goes to Otis for questions around racial issues?
Can I answer?
Yeah, please.
Probably because it kind of goes back. I think it was in your class where you said, like, we were talking about how in order to be considered excellent or even good at something, a black person has to work twice as hard. So it's kind of like if we take that idea and then we just put it in everyday life, it's kind of like I have to know the struggles and understand how to be with every race, because I already have a lot pitted against me. A person only has to understand their race and the problems within their race when they don't have to worry about what might happen to them
Yep.
or what consequences they may face for doing day-to-day things.
Yep. Absolutely. So another way to put what Tanaya just said, right? For Black folks, our survival is dependent on us knowing racial dynamics, right? We don't have the luxury not to know how racism plays out because that could very well cost us our lives, right? It's the old adage that when in a Black household, when they have a child come into age, there's a conversation that goes on. In a white household, when a child comes to age, there's a conversation that also goes on, right? In that white household, they're going to talk about the birds and the bees, right? But in that Black household, they're going to have to talk about how to survive interactions with police, what to do when you encounter racist white folks, right? Especially if we're talking about in the 1960s and before then, because I believe this was published in the 1960s. But if you read what's going on, this is probably taking place, the story takes place a lot earlier than that, right? So your survival is dependent on you being aware of racial circumstances. So Otis's parents are telling him things that Jesse's parents aren't telling him, right? So that's why he goes to Otis to answer those questions. That's the significance of Otis in the story, right? But Jesse's parents is teaching him something, right? They are passing down traditions to Jesse, right? He is learning about race because he's going to a picnic, right? Does anybody know the original meaning for the term picnic? What is this story about? Brianna said it earlier. What is this story about? What event? What phenomenon?
Lynching.
Lynchings. Yep. So, if we are to take this back to this term that we in America call picnicking, right? It is literally to pick a nigga and hang him. And this is what Baldwin is describing within the story, right? And this is how he writes it. Is that where they got him now? Asked Jesse's father. By this time, there were 3 cars piled behind the first one, with everyone looking excited and shining. And Jesse noticed that they were carrying food. It was like a 4th of July picnic, right? So again, it's the passing down of tradition, right? It's part of how to be a man that Jesse's father is going to take him to this event so he can understand what manhood and whiteness is within this country. Not to mention that this is a social event that the whole city is attending, right? Cars are lined up to watch this take place. And as Jesse's kind of watching what's unfolding, there's a question that keeps popping up in his head. What did he do? What did the man do? What did he do? In other words, what did he do to deserve this, right? It's not possible that my parents and my parents' friends and the people who are teaching me how to grow up in this world are so inhumane, so savage, so heartless that they just do this because, right? This individual had to do something to deserve this treatment. What did he do? And again, for me, that takes me back to Baldwin's notion of the maintenance of innocence, right? Their innocence is maintained because he obviously did something wrong to deserve this. And then I found it interesting the love that Jesse feels for his parents in that moment, right? His mother never looked as beautiful. He never loved his father more, okay? It's interesting. And then the way it ends, well, the way the scene of his childhood ends, right? He says, whatever the fire had left undone, the hands and the knives and the stones of the people had accomplished. The head was carved in, one eye was torn out, one ear was hanging. But one had to look carefully to realize this, for it was now merely a black charred object on the black charred ground. So essentially, what he's saying, right? The body has been hung, the body's about to be burned, and they go through the process of dismembering the body, right? Cutting off his privates, starts cutting off his ear, and he says, right, whatever the fire left undone. So after the body burns, if there's anything left, they'll come back and start getting souvenirs, right? So let's think about what this is. They're going to this event, this lynching, as if it's a sporting event, right? They got their picnic baskets. The whole town is gathering to watch this. They cheer to hear the screams of the man burning, right? And once his body has been charred, they go to get themselves souvenirs, right? And this is historically accurate to where when these things happen, people would walk away with fingers, walk away with toes, ears, lips, genitals, right? In fact, there was a time when homes were being sold in the South, right? And they would go through the attic of these homes. They would find the body parts of people who experienced these lynchings. They would find the body parts for those who took the souvenir home and kept it. In fact, often these scenes that Baldwin depicts became postcards, and they would send them across the country to show family members how well they're doing in their particular town, right? And we close the story out with Jesse being able to perform his manly duties now that he has went back in time and realized and remembered this lynching that his father took him to, right? Because during that time, this racial issue was under control. The black folks knew their place, right? And that level of power that he felt in that moment as a kid allowed him to perform his duties with his wife that night, right? So what Baldwin is also pointing us to is the connection between sexual desire and power. There's a correlation there, and Baldwin is attentive to that correlation. Okay, so I'm gonna put my notes on pause there. Let's get into our fishbowl. If you have not gone twice, I suggest you get to get one of your fish bowls in today. Is there any volunteers?
I'll volunteer.
Okay, we got Tanaya. We're gonna get 3 people. So can we get 2 more? Any other volunteers before I start calling?
Volunteer too.
Okay, Emiliana, yep. 1 more. Anyone else? All right, so I'll call that random. Carlos, are you prepared to fishbowl today?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we'll end it with that. So you remember, you guys could talk about your breakout rooms, you could talk about your journal notes, or you could talk about the notes that I just delivered. All that is on the table. Whoever wants to set it off, it's on you.
Can I start it off?
Please.
I was gonna make a comment from your notes actually.
Okay.
There were 2 points that had really intrigued me. The first one was where we had kind of discussed that Black people don't have the luxury to explore certain encounters because it can cost us our lives. And then just this ending point that you were on where you were talking about the sense like how he was aroused when he remembered what had happened in the lynching, how he just like the power that he felt was allowing him to feel aroused. I kind of think to present day, like people that are still racist, present day, they feel like they should have a certain authority in situations. And when they don't have that authority, that's when you have those Karens gone wild or videos of people just lashing out or having mental breakdowns because they can't handle the fact that they don't have power in a situation. So I just think, I don't know, it's unfortunate that I'm able to make these connections because it just shows like, yeah, we've moved from that position, but mentally some people are still there. Mentally, some people feel like Black people or minorities in general have a place. And when they don't stay in their place, it's a problem. But truthfully, there isn't a place. We are all people of, well, for me, I believe we're all people of God's world. So he's looking at all of us the same. He's not looking at you or me as superior or inferior because the color of our skin. That's not how it was written in the Bible. But again, the Bible is up for interpretation. So some people interpret the Bible to fuel their racism or their evil thoughts. And I don't know. It's frustrating, but it's also eye-opening. It like helps me to improve how I look at the world and how I look at certain people's actions and reactions. Like, you make the decision once you get older to still have a bias against a certain group of people. But when you're growing up and in your household, all you see is, well, I treated them like this, but I have a reason. They scared me, or they didn't do what I wanted them to do, so I had to do this. When you grow up and you're trained to think like that, it would be hard to come out of that mindset. So I don't know. That's where my thinking is.
And for me tonight, it makes you question the notion of progress that they love to tout so much, right?
Right.
You call out. Carlos or Emiliano?
Hello.
Yeah.
I'd also like to agree with Tanaya, and I would like to talk about like the two pillars, kind of, and how I see it nowadays, like in certain events where like uh a darker skin tone person is killed by a cop, or like a white supremacist cop, just because they say a black person is unarmed, but just because they are like not following what the cop is saying and they want power over them, they shoot them, and like, oh, it's covered up, even though it's not okay, and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely, Emiliano. And then they have the justice system to maintain their innocence. Yep.
Yeah, in a way it's like a grown person like throwing a tantrum.
Yeah. I'm gonna let Carlos go, but I'm gonna circle back to that, Emiliano.
I just want to talk about how this book examines sexual insecurity as a kind of metaphor for understanding racial oppression, along with the fear that racist whites felt about the possibility of losing their power and dominance. Basically, it shows the paranoid reflections racist whites had on African Americans.
Yeah, I would agree that that's at play, but I think there's also a little more going on,
Yeah,
and I'll speak to that as well, Carlos.
yeah,
Because one of the things with Baldwin that he does very well, and you'll see this when you read him next week also, yes, he's attentive to how this notion of white inferiority is in fact impacting black folks, but he's more interested in like how this notion of white inferiority is in fact impacting white people, right? Because
yeah,
the main character in the story is white, right?
yeah,
And Baldwin is exploring how these situations are not allowing him to even feel comfortable. He can't sleep. He can't do his normal, duties in the bedroom. So he's being impacted as a white man trying to perform these acts of white power, right? So
yeah,
it's a dual read at place. You're absolutely right, Carlos, that he is talking about how black folks are being impacted by this system of racism, but he's more interested in how white people are being impacted.
Oh, I see.
Um, Emiliano mentioned it's kind of childlike in the way that they perform and they act. And you look at these videos of these Karens that Tanaya mentioned, it is very childlike. They're throwing temper tantrums, right? Um, and I find it funny. Oftentimes when I engage Baldwin in classes, and you'll see this next week when he starts to talk about the love and the type of love that we as black folks should have for these white people. He almost writes it as a paternalistic love in the sense that they're childlike in their behavior, they're naive in their behavior, so we have to be patient with them. And again, you'll see this more when we read next week. But that's not really what Baldwin is getting us wants us to think about, right? And I'll go into more detail next week, but I thought it was interesting that you picked up on that early, Emiliano. And normally that childlike conversation comes up when I start talking about Baldwin's interpretation of love, right? Um, one of his famous quotes is, "If I love you, I must make you aware of the things that you don't see," right? And oftentimes, people understand that and equate that to a paternalistic type of love. But what Baldwin is really saying with his understanding of love, what I would call the Baldwinian understanding of love, is not about like a romantic holding hands in the park type love. That's not what Baldwin's dealing with. Love for Baldwin is to do the work that a mirror does, right? Like the mirror is going to show you exactly how you act. It's not going to sugarcoat or it's not going to tell you a fluffy story about yourself. If your shit ain't matching and you go in the mirror's gonna tell you that your shit ain't matching, right? So he says that's the type of love, that's the type of work that love should do. So when he advocates and you read next week and you hear him talking about loving our white brothers, our white countrymen, he's not saying like let's go have kids with them and shit like that. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about we have to be brutally honest and brutally truthful and speak to their inhumanity in the way that they're performing, right? That's the type of love that Baldwin is speaking to. And again, you'll kind of get deeper into that as we go into next week. I also want to throw one more thing out there based on Tanaya's comments. And it's not just Tanaya, I hear it a lot because even if you think about the story, right, it's as if racism is being taught, right? But really, what it is, it's a socialization. I was doing my PhD and I had a race and education course, and we had to read this book. It's titled The First R. And the premise of the book is a sociologist did, she's either an educator or a sociologist. They did a case study for 3 years in a preschool, kindergarten, first grade, and second grade. And they were looking to see how these children at this age, from the ages of like what 4 to 6 or 7, how they perform racism. And what she found is that racism is not, in fact, a learned behavior, right? It's not that the parents are teaching their children how to be racist. That's not what's going on. What she argues is that the society is teaching the children how to be racist.
Ooh, can I speak on this real quick?
Yeah, go for it, please.
I remember there was something called like the doll study. I don't know if you know about it, but they had white children brought them in, and like they pointed, like they had dolls of varying degrees of color, darker to lighter to darker or whatnot. And they would ask them questions. What child do you out of these 4 dolls, which one do you think is the bad one?
Mm-hmm.
And when the white children had picked the dolls, they had all it was the darker dolls. And they asked the black children the dolls. They said they didn't know.
Yep.
And it was like, damn.
Yep. And then there were some black kids who would pick the black doll as being the bad one.
That too.
They asked them which doll is the pretty doll or the good looking doll.
So,
Everyone said the white doll. Yeah. So and take that along with what's being argued in this book. Kids become racist because they watch racist cartoons. They hear racist children's stories. So no, their parents aren't explicitly teaching them racism. But what she does say is what does not happen in these white homes are the anti-racist conversations. They're not teaching their children that, right? And that's what she says the fall off is. Because that's the only way that you can combat a racist society is by teaching anti-racism. And she says that's where the white households failed to do. They feel that, in the book, she argues that the white households feel they don't, by not talking about racism, they're not contributing to racist ideologies and propaganda, right? So I just throw that out there to have us think about this notion of racism being taught in a little more nuanced way, right? Because you can't come up in an anti-black society and not be anti-black, right? That's why you have black people who are anti-black, Candace Owens and all the and the likes and the sorts, right? Cool. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, concerns about the reading? Anybody? Ricardo, what did you think about the reading? Ricardo? What are your thoughts about the reading or the conversation we had in class today?
I agree that it was very descriptive to where it was like it brings you into the book, like you could imagine it very well.
Yeah.
You could see. Yeah.
Yeah, that's Baldwin's, to me, that's his claim to fame, his descriptive writing. Next week we'll be on the corners of Harlem, New York, and you'll see how descriptive he gets with that. Giselda, what were your thoughts about today's conversation or the reading? Gisela, we're waiting on you. What's shocking to see?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, yeah. So shocking to see how like the difference between white and black households, how sorry, I was doing something. How white people, they don't seem that they need to like contribute to not showing their kids, but they just neglect like racism, I guess, in effect, in
Yeah,
a way.
yeah. And I think that goes back to what Tanaya said earlier in class, that they have the luxury and the convenience and the privilege to ignore those conversations because their survival is not dependent on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let me show you guys for next week. And again, we'll be with Baldwin one more week. So we'll have Baldwin next week, a midterm review. Excuse me, a midterm review the week after that, and then we'll have your midterm. Um, so for next week's reading, we're in weeks 8 through 11 still, and it's going to be the PDF, A Letter to My Nephew. It's from the book A Fire Next Time, probably one of Baldwin's most famous texts. So read that. I'll email it out to you guys this week, but if you want to get that started now, that's available to you. Is there any other questions, comments, or concerns?